Tibetan Sage by Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. Read for you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC. Foreword and Chapter 1. Foreword. People hooted and jeered when, some few years ago, I wrote in the third eye that I had flown in kites. One would have thought that I had committed a great crime in saying that. But now, well, we look about and we can see people flying in kites. Some of them are high above the water, being towed by a speedboat. Yet others are kites with a man aboard, and he stands on the edge of a cliff or high piece of ground, and then he jumps off and he's actually flying in a kite. Nobody says now that Lobsang Rampa was right, but they certainly did hoot when I wrote about kite flying. There have been quite a number of things which were science fiction a few years ago, but now, well, now they are almost everyday occurrences. We can have a satellite in space, and in London we can pick up the television programs from the USA or from Japan. I predicted that. We also now have had a man, or rather men, walking on the moon. All my books are true, and they are gradually being proved true. This book is not a novel. It's not science fiction. It's the absolutely unvarnished truth of what happened to me. And I again state there is no author's license in the book. I say this book is true, but you may want to believe it to be science fiction or something like that. Well, fine, you're quite at liberty to have a good laugh and call it science fiction, and perhaps before you have actually finished reading the book, some event will occur which will prove my books true. But I will tell you now that I will not answer any questions about this book. I have had such an enormous mail about the other books, and people do not even put in return postage. And with postal rates as they are at present, sometimes it takes more to reply to a reader's letter than he paid for the book in the first case. Well, here is the book. I hope you like it. I hope you find it believable. If you do not find it believable, it may be that you have not yet reached the necessary stage of evolution. Chapter 1. Lobsang, Lobsang! Dimly I seemed to swim up from the depths of a sleep of exhaustion. It had been a terrible day, but now, well, I was being called. Again the voice broke in, Lobsang! But I suddenly felt commotion about me, opened my eyes, and thought the mountain was falling on top of me. A hand reached out in a quick jerk, lifted me up from my place of rest, and swung me rapidly aside, barely in time, too, because a massive rock with sharp edges slid down behind me and ripped off my robe. Quickly I stumbled to my feet, and in a half-daze followed him to a little ledge at the far end, of which was a very small hermitage. About us, rocks and snow came pelting down. Suddenly we saw the bent figure of the old hermit hurrying as fast as he could towards us, but no, a huge collection of rocks rolled down the mountain and swept away the hermitage and the hermit, and the projecting rock on which the hermitage had stood. The rock was about 200 feet in length, and it was swept away as a leaf is swept away in a gale. My guide, the Lama, Mingyardondup, was holding me firmly by the shoulders. About us was darkness, not a glimmer of starlight, no gleam of a flickering candle from the houses of Lhasa. Everything was dark. Suddenly there was a fresh barrage of immense rocks and sand and snow and ice. The ledge upon which we so precariously stood tipped towards the mountain, and we felt ourselves sliding, sliding. We seemed to be forever sliding, and at last we came to a hearty bump. I think I blacked out for a time because I suddenly came to my senses again, thinking of the circumstances which had caused us to go to this very remote hermitage. We had been at the Potala playing with a telescope which had been given to the Dalai Lama as a goodwill present from an English gentleman. Suddenly I saw prayer flags waving high up on the mountainside. They seemed to be waving in some sort of a code. Quickly I passed the telescope to my guide and pointed up to the waving flags. He stood there with the telescope braced against the walls of the topmost level of the Potala. He stood there for some time, staring, and then he said, "The hermit is in need of help. He is ill. Let us inform the abbot and say that we are ready to go." Abruptly he closed the telescope, and he gave it to me to put back in the Dalai Lama's storeroom of special gifts. I ran with the thing, being particularly careful not to trip and not to drop that telescope, the first that I had ever seen. And then I went out and filled my pouch with barley, checked that my tinder was adequate, and then I just hung around waiting for the Lama Mingyar Dondab. Soon he appeared with 2 bundles, one great heavy bundle which he had on his shoulders, and a smaller bundle which he put on my shoulders. "We will go by horse to the foot of that mountain, and then we shall have to send the horses home and climb and climb. It will be quite a hard climb, too. I have done it before." We got to our horses and rode down the steps to where the outer ring of roads surrounds Lhasa. Soon we reached the turning off point, and as I always did, I took a quick look toward the left to the home where I had been born. But there was no time to think about that now. We were on a mission of mercy. The horses began to labor, to pant and to snort. The climbing was too much for them. Their feet kept slipping on the rocks. At last, with a sigh, the Lama Mingyar Dondab said, "Well, Lobsang, the horses finish here. From now on, we depend upon our own weary feet." We got off the horses, and the Lama patted them and told them to return home. They turned about and trotted back along the path with renewed life at the thought of going home instead of having to climb further. We arranged our bundles and checked over our heavy sticks. Any crack or flaw which had developed could prove fatal, so we checked them and checked the other things we were carrying. We had our flint and our tinder. We had our food supply, and so at last, without a backward look, we started climbing up the hard, hard mountain rock. It seemed to be made of glass, it was so hard and so slippery. We put our fingers and our toes in any little crevice, and gradually, barking our shins and scraping our hands, we made our way up to a ledge. Here we stopped for a time to regain our breath and our strength. A little stream came from a crevice in the rock, so we had a drink, and then we made some sampa. It was not very savory. It had to be made with cold, cold water. There was no room on the ledge for fire making. But with our sampa and a drink, we felt refreshed again and discussed which way we should climb. The surface was smooth, and it seemed impossible that anyone could ever climb up that face, but we had set to as had others before us. Gradually we inched upwards. Gradually the tiny speck, which had been visible to us, became larger and larger until we could see the individual rocks which formed the hermitage. The hermitage was perched on the very end of a rocky spur which stood out from the side of the mountain. We climbed up under it, and then, with immense effort, we reached the side of the spur, where we sat for several moments, gasping for breath, because here we were high above the plain of Lhasa, and the air was rarefied and bitterly cold. At last we felt able to stand again, and we made our way much more easily this time, until we reached the entrance of the hermitage. The old hermit came to the door. I peered inside, and I was absolutely amazed by the smallness of the room. Actually, there would not be room for 3 people, so I resigned myself to staying outside. The Lama, Minyar-Dondup, nodded his approval, and I turned away as the door closed behind him. Nature has to be attended to at all times, and sometimes nature can be very pressing indeed, so I wandered around looking for sanitary facilities. And yes, right on the edge of that jutting rock, there was a flat rock projecting even further out. It had a convenient hole in it, which I could see had been man-made or man-enlarged. As I crouched down over that hole, I could find a solution to something that had been puzzling me. On our way up, we had passed a peculiar-looking heap and what seemed to be yellowish shards of ice. Some of them looked like yellowish ice rods. Now I was sure that those very puzzling mounds were evidence that men had lived in the hermitage for some time, and I gleefully added my own contribution. That taken care of, I wandered around and found the rock to be excessively slippery. But I walked along the path and came to what was obviously a moving rock. It was in the form of a ledge, and I wondered, without any real interest, why there should be a ledge of rock in that particular position. Being inquisitive, I examined the rock with more than usual care, and I found my interest mounting, because clearly it was man-made. And yet how could it be man-made? It was in such a strange position. So I just gave a desultory kick to the rock, forgetting that I was barefooted. So I nursed my injured toes for a few moments, and then turned away from the ledge to examine the opposite side, the side up which we had climbed. It was absolutely amazing and almost unbelievable to think that we had climbed up that sheer face. It looked like a sheet of polished rock as I gazed down, and I felt definitely queasy at the thought of climbing down. A note from BlueFriend. I am inserting a little patch here because there are 2 pages missing from the online copies of this book, beginning at page 10. I am inserting here that while Lobsang and the Lama Minyar-Dondup are visiting the old hermit, an avalanche begins on the mountain side. The ground gives way beneath their feet, and they are dropped into an enormous cavern. Unfortunately, the hermit they were visiting was killed in the rock fall. And now to continue. I reached down to feel for my tinderbox and flint and jerked to full awareness of my immediate situation. Here I was, somewhere inside a mountain, without a stitch of clothing, without the vital barley and bowl and tinder and flint. I must have muttered some un-Buddhist-like exclamation because I heard a whisper, "Lobsang, Lobsang, are you all right?" Oh, my guide, the Lama Mingyar Dondup was with me. Immediately I felt reassured and replied, "Yes, here I am. I think I was knocked out when I fell, and I've lost my robe and all my possessions, and I haven't got the vaguest idea where we are or how we're going to get out. We need some light to see what can be done about your legs." He said, "I know this passage very well indeed. The old hermit was the keeper of great secrets of the past and of the future. Here is the history of the world from the time it started until the time it ends." He rested for a few moments and then said, "If you feel along the left-hand wall, you will come to a ridge. Now, if you push hard against that ridge, it will slide back and give access to a big recess, which has spare robes and ample barley. The first thing for you to do is open the closet and feel for tinder and flint and candles. You will find them on the third shelf from the bottom. If we have light, we can know how we can help each other." I carefully gazed along the left side of the Lama, and then I touched the left-hand wall of the passageway. It seemed to be a fruitless search. The wall was as smooth as could be, as smooth as if it had been made by human hands. Just as I was about to give up, I felt a sharp piece of rock. Actually, I thumped my knuckles against it and it knocked off a piece of skin. But I pushed and I pushed until I thought I would be unable to find the goods in the closet. With an extra special effort, and the rock slid sideways with a terrifying screech. Yes, there was a closet all right, and I could feel the shelves. First, I concentrated on the third shelf from the bottom. Here there were butter lamps, and I located the flint and the tinder. The tinder was the driest stuff I had ever used, and immediately it flared into flame. I lit the wick of a candle before very quickly extinguishing the tinder, which was already reaching to burn my fingers. "2 candles," Lobsang, "one for you and one for me. There is an ample supply there, enough if necessary to last us a week." The Lama lapsed into silence, and I looked round to see what was in the closet that we could use, and I saw a stave made of metal, iron, it seemed to be, and I found that I could hardly lift it. But it seemed to me that with a stave like that we might prise the rocks off his legs. So I walked back with a candle and told the Lama what I was going to do. Then I went back for that metal bar. It seemed to me that it was the only means of freeing my guide and friend from the grip of that boulder. When I reached the boulder, I put down the metal bar and went on hands and knees, trying to find how I could obtain leverage. There were plenty of rocks about, but I doubted my own strength. I could hardly lift that bar as it was, but eventually I worked out a scheme. If I gave the Lama one of the staves, he could perhaps push a rock under the boulder if I could elevate the thing a bit. He agreed with me that it might be possible, and he said, "It is the only thing we can do, Lobsang, because if I can't get free of this boulder here, my bones will stay. So let's get busy with it now." I found a fairly square piece of rock. It was about 4 hands in thickness. I put it right down against the boulder, and then gave a wooden stave to the Lama for him to try with his part of the proceedings. We decided that, yes, if I could lift the boulder, the victim should be able to push the square rock in under, and that would give us enough room to get his legs out. I pored over the boulder where it rested on the ground to see if there was any place, anywhere, that I could safely insert the bar. At last I found such a place, and I rammed the claw end in as far as I could under the boulder. It was a simple matter then to hunt around and find another boulder which I could put under the bar near the claw end. "Ready!" I yelled, nearly stunning myself with the strength, with all my weight on the iron bar. No, it did not move. I was not strong enough. So I rested a moment or two, and then I looked around for the heaviest rock that I could lift. Having found it, I lifted it and carried it to the iron bar. There I balanced it on the extreme end of the bar and put all my weight on top of it, at the same time holding it from falling off the bar. To my delight, there was a little hesitation and a little jerk, and slowly the bar moved down to the ground level. The Lama Mingyar Dondap called out, "It's all right, Lobsang. I've got the block underneath, and you can release the bar now. We can get my legs out." I was overjoyed and moved back to the other side of the boulder, and yes, it was off the Lama's legs. But the legs were raw and bleeding, and we feared that they were broken. Very, very gingerly we tried to move his legs, and he could move them, so I got down and crawled under the boulder until I reached his feet. Then I suggested that he should lift himself up with his elbows and try to move backwards while I pushed on the soles of his feet. Gingerly, very gingerly, I pushed on the bottoms of his feet, and it was obvious that, while the skin and flesh lacerations were severe, there were no broken bones. The Lama kept trying to pull himself out from under the boulder. It was very difficult, and I had to push with all my strength against his feet and twist his legs a bit to avoid an outcrop of some stones under the boulder. The outcrop, I surmised, was the only thing that had saved his legs from being absolutely squashed, and it was still giving us trouble. But at last, with more than a sigh of relief, his legs were quite clear, and I crawled under the boulder to help him sit on a ledge of rock. 2 little candles were not much to go by, so I went back to that stone closet and got a half-dozen more with the sort of basket in which to carry the things. We lit all the candles and examined the legs very carefully. They were literally in shreds. From the thighs to the knees they were badly abraded. From the knees to the feet the flesh was flapping because it had been cut into strips. The Lama told me to go back, get some rags which were in a box, and he told me also to bring a jar with some paste in it. He described it exactly, and I went back to get the jar, the rags, and a few other things. The Lama, Mingyardoned up, brightened up considerably when he saw that I had brought disinfecting lotion as well. I washed his legs from the hips down, and then, at his suggestion, I pushed the flapping strips of flesh back into place, covering the bones. The leg bones had been showing very, very clearly, so I covered them with the flesh and then glued the flesh in position with the ointment stuff which I had brought. After about half an hour, the ointment was almost dry, and it looked as if the legs were in firm casts. I tore some of the rags into strips and wound them around his legs to help keep the plaster in place. Then I took all the things back to the stone closet, with the exception of our candles, 8 in all. We blew out 6 and carried the others inside our robes. I picked up our 2 wooden staves and gave them to the Lama, who accepted them gratefully. And then I said, "I will move around to the other side of the boulder, and then I shall be able to see how we are going to manage to get you out." The Lama smiled and said, "I know all about this place, Lobsang. It's been here about 1,000,000 years, and it was made by the people who first populated this country of ours. Provided no rocks have shifted and blocked the way, we shall be safe enough for a week or 2. He nodded toward the direction of the outside world and said, "I think it is unlikely that we shall be able to get out that way, and if we cannot get out through one of the volcanic vents, then some later explorers, in 1,000 years or so, may find 2 interesting skeletons upon which to ponder." I moved forward, passing the tremendous side of the tunnel and the side of the boulder, and it was such a tight fit that I wondered how the Lama was going to get through. Still, I thought, where there is a will, there is a way, and I came to the conclusion that if I crouched at the bottom of the boulder, the Lama could walk over me, and he would be that much higher up, and so his legs and hips would get past the biggest bulge in the boulder. When I suggested it, he was very, very reluctant, saying he was far too heavy for me, but after a few painful tries, he came to the conclusion that there just was no other way. So I piled a few small rocks around the boulder so that I would have a fairly flat bed on which to crouch, and then, when I got down on my hands and knees, I told the Lama that I was ready. Very quickly he put one foot on my right hip and the other foot on my left shoulder, and with a quick movement he was through, past the boulder and onto clear ground the other side. I stood up and saw that he was perspiring terribly with the pain and the fear that he might harm me. We sat down for a few moments to regain our breath and our strength. We couldn't have any sampa, as our bowls had been lost, and so had our barley, but I remembered seeing such things in the stone closet. Once more I made a trip to the wall and raked through the wooden bowls that were there, picking the best one for the Lama and the next best one for myself. Then I gave them both a good scouring with fine sand, which was so plentiful in that tunnel. The 2 bowls I put on a shelf side by side, and then I put in an adequate amount of barley from the store kept in the closet. After that, there was merely the task of lighting a small fire. There was flint and tinder in the closet, and firewood too, And then, with the hunk of butter which was in the closet, we mixed up the gooey mess which we called sampa. Without a word we sat down and ate that little meal. Soon after, we both felt much better and able to continue. I checked our supplies, now replenished from that store closet, and yes, we both had a bowl each, tinder and flint, and a bag of barley each, and that really was all we possessed in the world, except for the 2 stout wooden staves. Once again we set out, battered and bruised, and after what seemed walking for eternity, we came to a stone right across the path, the end of the tunnel, or so I thought. But the Lama said, "No, no, this isn't the end. Push on the bottom of that big slab, and it will tilt from the middle, and then if we stoop, we can get through." I pushed on the bottom, as instructed, and with an awful screech, the slab moved to a horizontal position, and remained in that position. I held it for safety, while the Lama painfully crawled under, and then I pushed the slab down again into its correct place. Darkness, painful darkness, which was made to appear even darker by the 2 little guttering candles. The Lama Mingyar Dondap said, "Put out your candle, Lobsang, and I will put out mine, and then we will see the daylight." See the daylight? I thought that his experiences and the pain he must be suffering from had given him hallucinations. However, I blew out my candle, and for some time could smell the smoking wick, which had been saturated with rancid butter. The Lama said, "Now just wait a few moments, and we shall have all the light we want." I stood there feeling an absolute fool, standing in what was now perfect darkness, not a glimmer of light from anywhere. I could have called it a sounding darkness, because there seemed to be a thump, thump, thump squeeze, but that was dismissed from my mind as I saw what appeared to be a sunrise. Over at one side of what was apparently a room, a glowing ball appeared. It was red, and looked like red-hot metal. Quickly the red faded into yellow and then on to white, the white blue of daylight. Soon everything was revealed in stark reality. I stood there with my mouth open, marveling at what I saw. The room, or whatever it was, occupied a greater space than did the patala. The patala could have been put into that room. The light was brilliant, and I was almost hypnotized by the decorations on the walls and by the strange things which littered the floor space without getting in one's way when one walked. An amazing place, eh, Lobsang? This was made more years ago than the mind of man can comprehend. It used to be the headquarters of a special race who could do space travel and just about everything else. Through millions of years, it still works. Everything is intact. Certain of us were known as the guardians of the inner temple. This is the inner temple. I walked over to examine the closest wall, and it appeared to be covered with writing of some sort, writing which I instinctively felt was not the writing of any race on earth. The Lama picked up my thoughts by telepathy and replied, "Yes, this was built by the race of gardeners who brought humans and animals to this world." He stopped speaking and pointed out a box set against a wall a little distance away. He said, "Will you go over there to that closet and fetch me 2 pieces of stick with the short piece across the top?" Obediently, I walked across to the closet which he pointed out. The door opened easily, and I was absolutely fascinated by the contents. It seemed to be full of things for medical usage. In one corner there was a number of these sticks with the bars across one end. I picked out 2 and saw that they would be able to support a man. I had no name such as crutches in those days, but I took 2 back to the Lama, and he immediately put the short bars under his armpits, and about halfway between the top and the bottom there was a sort of rod sticking out. The Lama Mingyar Dandap grasped these rods and said, "There you are, Lobsang. These things help the cripples to walk. Now I am going across to that closet, and I can put proper casts on my legs, and then I shall be able to get about as usual while the flesh heals and while the bruises depart from the bones." He walked over, and being naturally inquisitive, I walked beside him. He said, "Fetch our staves, and we will put them in this corner so that we can have them when we need them." He turned away from me and continued his poking about in the closet. I turned away too, and went back and picked up our staves and took them back to rest against the corner of that closet. Lobsang, do you think you could drag in our bundles and that steel bar? It is not iron as you think, but something very much harder and stronger, and it is called steel." I turned once again and went to that slab through which we had entered. I pushed against the top of the thing, and it swung to remain horizontal and motionless. It was no trouble for me to duck under the stone, which I left in its horizontal position. The light was a blessing. It was a very real blessing, because it shone quite a way down that tunnel, and I could see my way past the side of the tunnel and the big boulder which had caused us so much trouble. Our bundles with all our possessions were on the opposite side, so with difficulty I got past the boulder and reached for the pouches. They seemed to be shockingly heavy, and I put it down to our weakened state through the lack of food. First, I took the 2 pouches back and left them just inside the doorway, and then I went back for the steel bar. I could hardly lift the thing. It made me pant and grunt like an old man, so I let one end drop while I firmly held on to the other. And I found that by walking backwards and pulling on the steel bar with both hands, I could just manage to make it move. It took me quite a while to get it around the boulder, but after that it was fairly easy going. Now I had to push the bundles under the slab and into that immense room, and then I got the steel bar, and I decided I had never moved such a heavy weight in my life before. I maneuvered it into the room and then pushed down the slab of the door so that once again we had a smooth wall without an opening. The Lama, Mingyar Dandap, had not wasted his time. Now his legs were encased in shiny metal, and once again he looked perfectly fit. Lobsang, let us have a meal before we look round, because we shall be here about a week. While you were fetching these things, he pointed to the bundles of the steel rod, I have been in telepathic communication with a friend at the Potala, and he tells me a terrific gale is raging. He advised me to stay where we are until the gale has abated. The weather prophets said the storm would rage for about a week. I felt really gloomy about it because I was sick of this tunnel and not even the room could interest me much. In spite of the size of the room, I was feeling a certain amount of claustrophobia, which sounds impossible, but was not. I felt like an animal in a cage. However, the pangs of hunger were stronger than any fears, and I watched with pleasure as the Lama made our meal. He made it better than anyone, I thought, and it was so nice to sit down to a hot meal. I took a mouthful of the stuff, which really is a polite name for sampa, and marveled at the flavor of it. It was a very pleasant flavor indeed, and I felt my strength coming back and my gloom disappearing. After I finished my bowlful, the Lama said, "Have you had enough, Lobsang? You can have as much as you wish. There is plenty of food here, enough, in fact, to feed a small lamasery. I'll tell you about it sometime, but now, would you like more?" "Oh, thank you," I replied. "I certainly could do with a little more, and that has such a pleasant taste to it. I've never tasted anything like that before." The Lama chuckled as he turned away to get me more food, and then he actually burst out into a laugh. "Look, Lobsang," he said. "Look at this bottle. It is the best brandy, kept entirely for medical purposes. I think that we can consider our incarceration here as warranting a little brandy to give flavor to the sampa." I took the bowl he proffered to me and sniffed it appreciatively, but at the same time dubiously, because I had always been taught that these intoxicating liquors were the works of the devils, and now I was being encouraged to taste it. Never mind, I thought, it's good stuff when one doesn't feel too fresh. I set to and soon got into an awful mess. We had only our fingers, you know, nothing like a knife, fork, or spoon, not even chopsticks, but fingers. And after meals we used to wash our hands with fine sand, which would take off sampa with wonderful efficiency, besides at the same time taking off a bit of skin if one was too energetic. I scooped out sampa, not with my fingers alone, but I brought the palm of my hand right into play, and then suddenly, quite without warning, I fell over backwards. I like to say that I fell asleep through overtiredness, but the Lama said I was dead drunk when he laughingly told the abbot about it later. Drunk or not, I slept and slept and slept, and still when I wakened, that wonderful golden light suffused the room. I gazed up at, well, I suppose it was the ceiling, but the ceiling was so far up I could not tell where it was. It was truly an immense room, as if the whole wretched mountain was hollow. Sunlight, Lobsang, sunlight, and it will work 24 hours a day. The light it gives is absolutely without heat. It is precisely the same temperature as the air around us. Don't you think it is better to have light like this than smelly, smoking candles? I looked about again and just could not see how there could be sunlight when we were entombed in a rock room, and I said as much. The Lama replied, Yes, this is a marvel of marvels. I have known it all my life, but no one knows how it works. Cold light is a miraculous invention, and this was invented or discovered 1,000,000 or so years ago. They developed a method of storing sunlight and making it available even on the darkest nights. There is none of it in the city nor in the temple because we just do not know how to make it. This is the only place I know where there is this type of lighting. 1,000,000 or so, you said. That is almost beyond my comprehension. I think it is a figure, like a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or something like that, followed by a number of zeros. 6, I think it is, but that's only a guess, and in any case it is so vast a number that I can't realize it. It doesn't count for anything for me. 10 years, 20 years, yes, I can relate to that, but longer? No. How was this room made? I asked as I trailed my fingers idly over some inscription on the wall. I jumped back in fright as a certain click occurred, and a part of the wall slid back. Lobsang, you have made a discovery. None of us who have been here knew there was another room attached to this. Cautiously we peered into the open doorway, and as soon as our heads passed the doorpost, the light came on, and I noted that as we left the first great room, the light faded at our absence. We looked about, almost afraid to move because we did not know what perils were there or what traps we might fall into. But eventually we plucked up courage and walked over to a great something standing in the middle of the floor. It was a tremendous structure. Once it had been shiny, but now it had a dull gray glaze. It was about 4 or 5 men tall, and it looked something like 2 dishes, one on top of the other. We walked around, and there, at the far side, we saw a gray metal ladder extending down from a doorway in the machine to the floor. I ran forward, forgetting that as a young man in holy orders I should show more decorum. But I ran forward and hastily climbed the ladder without even bothering to see if it was safely fixed. It was. Once again, as my head blocked the doorway, lights came on inside the machine. The Lama, Mingyar up, not to be outdone, climbed up into the interior of the machine and said, "Ah, Lobsang, this is one of the chariots of the gods. You've seen them flitting about, haven't you?" "Oh, yes, sir," I replied. "I thought there were gods traversing our land to see that everything was all right, but of course I've never seen one as close as this before." End of chapter 1.